Keanu Reeves stood calmly in the first-class line, dressed simply, a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding him. A man nearby couldn't hide his disdain, watching Keanu with arrogance. What happened next would leave every passenger on that plane speechless and change one life forever. Before we dive into this story, tell us where you're watching from. If you love stories like this, subscribe to our channel. There's a special tale waiting for you tomorrow. The Los Angeles airport buzzed with activity. As usual, people hurried in every direction, conversations blending into a symphony of chaos and luggage rolling endlessly. Among it all, Keanu Reeves stood still, waiting patiently in the first-class line. His attire was simple: a plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, scuffed boots, and a backpack that seemed to carry the weight of countless journeys. He wasn't flashy, and because of that, most people didn't notice him. But for anyone paying closer attention, there was something striking about him. It wasn't just his clothes, but the calm energy he radiated. While those around him rushed and seemed anxious, Keanu appeared serene, as if the chaos couldn't touch him. He quietly observed his surroundings, taking in the moment. The contrast between him and the other passengers was undeniable, but he didn't seem to mind. Standing just behind Keanu in line was Victor Harding. Everything about Victor was the opposite of Keanu. His expensive suit, polished shoes, and commanding cologne screamed wealth and status. Every move he made felt deliberate, as if to broadcast his importance to the world. Victor's eyes swept over the line until they landed on Keanu. He smirked, unable to resist a jab. "First class, huh?" Victor remarked, his voice dripping with irony. "You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu turned to him, his expression calm and composed. "Yeah, the world is full of surprises," he replied simply. Victor frowned slightly, clearly expecting a more reactive response. He paused, then decided to press further. "Look, nothing personal," Victor began, his tone feigning politeness, "but you don't seem like the type for first class. It's rare to see someone so casual here." Before Keanu could respond, the boarding process began, and the line started moving. The two men followed silently, tickets in hand. Victor walked with brisk, purposeful strides, while Keanu maintained the same unhurried pace. Once aboard, the unexpected occurred. As Victor checked his ticket and looked up, he saw Keanu settling into the seat right beside his. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered under his breath, shaking his head. With a dry chuckle, he added, "Of all the places, it had to be here." Keanu glanced at him, offering a polite smile. "Looks like we're traveling together then," he said calmly. Victor crossed his arms, visibly uncomfortable. It wasn't just about sitting next to Keanu. It was the idea that the man he had judged moments ago was sharing the same exclusive space as him. He couldn't explain why, but Keanu's presence unsettled him. As economy passengers finished boarding, Victor decided to start a conversation, though his tone was far from friendly. "So, what do you do for a living?" Victor asked casually, though his voice carried a hint of judgment, as if he already knew the answer. Keanu, adjusting his backpack, glanced up. "I work in film," he replied simply. Victor raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time stuff." Keanu smiled slightly and shook his head. "Something like that," he answered. Victor laughed, his tone condescending. "It's interesting how people try to find their place, you know? But sometimes, certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone, like first class, for instance." Keanu regarded Victor for a moment, his calm demeanor unchanged. "I think we all have our place," he replied, "and sometimes it's exactly where we are." Victor chuckled dismissively. "That's cute, kind of philosophical, even. But real life isn't that simple." Keanu didn't respond immediately. He simply turned to the window, signaling that the conversation was over. But Victor wasn't finished. "You know," Victor said, leaning slightly closer, "you might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never truly belong to certain people." This time, Keanu didn't respond with words. He turned to Victor, his calm gaze now carrying a quiet firmness. It was the kind of look that spoke louder than anything he could have said. Victor leaned back in his seat, smirking as if he had won some unspoken battle. But in reality, the story was far from over. The plane took off, and shortly after, the in-flight service began. The flight attendant approached first class with drinks, and Victor made sure to stand out. "A glass of champagne," he requested confidently. "Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." First class with a bottle of water. Keanu accepted the bottle from the flight attendant with a calm demeanor and said, "I'm good with this." Sometimes, simplicity is all you need. Victor narrowed his eyes, clearly trying to decipher the remark, but quickly dismissed it. "Yeah, I suppose that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is meant to enjoy the finer things in life," Victor replied smugly. Keanu raised the bottle, took a small sip, and didn't respond right away. Around them, passengers were beginning to notice Victor's provocative tone, but since Keanu remained unbothered, no one felt the need to step in. "Maybe the best things are different for everyone," Keanu eventually said, his voice as composed as ever. Victor didn't like that answer. He inhaled deeply, trying to keep control of the conversation. "Or maybe," he countered, "people who say things like that just never had access to what really matters. Some things are just out of reach for certain people." The flight attendant, now serving another passenger, cast a discreet glance in their direction. She seemed ready to step in, but stopped when she noticed Keanu was handling the situation with ease. Keanu responded with nothing more than a faint smile before turning back to the window. Victor, however, wasn't satisfied. He wanted to provoke Keanu further, but was beginning to realize that rattling him was harder than expected. Victor believed he was winning the exchange, but to those around them, his arrogance was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Keanu's calmness, by contrast, was earning silent admiration. The flight attendant returned to their section of the cabin with another round of drinks. Victor took the opportunity to continue his string of provocations. "You know," he began, gesturing with his champagne glass, "life is just like flying first class. You work hard, earn your place, and then you enjoy the perks. But some people? Well, they're only here because they got lucky." Keanu placed his water bottle on the tray table and turned to face Victor directly. His gaze, still calm, carried a new depth, as though he had decided to respond more pointedly. "Luck or hard work," Keanu said in a serene yet firm tone, "we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" The nearby passengers, who had been quietly observing, were now paying closer attention. The cabin grew noticeably quieter, and a few people exchanged glances, sensing the subtle tension between the two men. Victor smirked, though his expression hinted at unease. "Well, I wouldn't say that," he replied, clearly trying to regain the upper hand. "Some of us operate on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here." Keanu leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. "I think the real value of being here," he gestured subtly to the seats around them, "isn't about what you have, but how you treat others." His words hung in the air like an unshakable truth. Several passengers nodded subtly, and a few exchanged approving looks. Victor, on the other hand, grew visibly uncomfortable. He laughed nervously, trying to mask his discomfort. "That's a good one, first-class philosophy," he quipped sarcastically. "Maybe you should start giving motivational talks." Keanu merely smiled faintly and turned back to face forward, ending the conversation without another word. His silence carried more weight than any retort. The atmosphere in first class shifted noticeably. Passengers began reacting subtly. Some whispered among themselves, while others exchanged disapproving glances toward Victor. A couple seated a few rows behind, who appeared to recognize Keanu, remained silent but clearly admired his composed handling of the situation. Victor, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly aware of the attention he was receiving, and not the kind he enjoyed. His once confident posture faltered slightly, though he wasn't ready to admit defeat. He still believed he could win this verbal sparring match. But the reactions around him told a different story, one he hadn't yet realized. As the flight attendant came by to collect empty glasses, Victor seemed determined to reclaim the upper hand. "You know what's funny?" he said, his tone laced with smugness. "People who don't have much to show for themselves are always the ones preaching humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Keanu leaned forward just slightly, meeting Victor's gaze directly. "I've noticed that the people who talk the most about what they have are often the ones who feel the emptiest inside," Keanu replied evenly, his words deliberate and piercing. For a moment, Victor seemed stunned, his expression faltering as he struggled to come up with a response. He opened his mouth, but failed to find the right words. Around them, passengers exchanged glances, visibly impressed by Keanu's handling of the provocations. Finally, Victor managed to recover. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," he said, trying to sound casual, "but the world is competitive. If you don't show what you've got, people will ignore you. That's just how things work." Keanu leaned back in his seat, his voice calm as ever. Maybe, he said, but I think real success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself. The weight of Keanu's words seemed to ripple through the cabin. Several passengers nodded subtly in agreement, while others shot disapproving looks at Victor, who was clearly unused to being challenged like this. By now, the dynamic in first class had completely shifted. Many passengers were fully engaged in the unspoken exchange, watching with quiet admiration for Keanu's composure. An older gentleman seated nearby shook his head, seemingly disapproving of Victor's behavior. The sudden wave of whispers and glances spreading across the cabin. However, the ripple effect of the revelation was undeniable. Passengers who had been quietly observing the exchange between Keanu and Victor now looked at Victor with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Victor's face turned pale, his mind racing as he processed the name that had just been spoken aloud. He stared at Keanu as if seeing him for the first time, the weight of his own arrogance sinking in. The realization hit like a tidal wave. He had been arguing, belittling, and attempting to assert dominance over Keanu Reeves, an international icon known for his humility and grace. Keanu, still seated with his tranquil demeanor, turned to Victor one last time, his voice steady but filled with meaning. "Victor," he began, "it doesn't matter who I am. What matters is how we choose to treat each other, regardless of status or recognition." The words were simple, yet they resonated deeply. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado replaced by a heavy silence. He glanced around, now fully aware of the disapproving stares from the other passengers. For the remainder of the flight, Victor kept his head down, seemingly lost in thought. He fiddled with his wedding band again, his mind replaying the confrontation and Keanu's words. Meanwhile, Keanu remained composed, sipping his water and gazing out the window as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than a fleeting moment. As the plane began its descent into Tokyo, the cabin was filled with an almost reverent silence. The passengers, having witnessed the exchange, seemed to reflect on their own lives and choices. When the plane landed, Keanu rose from his seat, offering a polite smile to the flight attendants and passengers who acknowledged him with quiet admiration. Victor, on the other hand, remained seated, unable to meet anyone's gaze. In that moment, Victor wasn't just humbled, he was transformed. The flight hadn't only changed the way others saw him, it had begun to change the way he saw himself. Victor opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He glanced around, noticing the curious and in some cases, disapproving glances of the other passengers. He looked utterly lost. Finally, sinking into his seat, he stammered, I didn't know. I mean, you didn't say who you were." Keanu kept his tone calm but firm. "I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually use my name as a calling card." Victor sat in stunned silence, his earlier arrogance melting into unease. After a moment, he managed to mutter, "I didn't mean to offend you. I didn't know who I was talking to." Keanu sighed softly, leaning forward slightly. "Victor, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people." Those words hung in the air like a weight, leaving Victor speechless. He glanced at Keanu, then at the other passengers, who were now more engaged than ever. The humiliation on Victor's face was undeniable. Breaking the tense silence, Keanu offered a final lesson. "You know, Victor, life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people putting others down just to feel bigger." Victor nodded slightly, for once without argument. It was clear the words struck deeper than any earlier exchange. Keanu leaned back in his seat, signaling the end of the conversation, while Victor remained motionless, staring at his hands as if replaying every word in his mind. For Victor, the confrontation wasn't just about Keanu. It was a confrontation with himself, a chance for reflection. As the minutes passed, the once confident Victor couldn't stop thinking about Keanu's words. Simple as they were, they resonated deeply. He began to recall moments in his life when he judged others without understanding their stories. "Maybe he's right," Victor murmured under his breath, barely aware of his own words. He stole a glance at Keanu, who was now calmly reading a book as if the exchange had never happened. Keanu's composed demeanor only amplified the impact. Victor finally found the courage to speak again as the plane began its descent. Turning to Keanu with lowered eyes, he said, "I need to apologize. Not because you're you, but because I was arrogant. I acted like a fool." Keanu looked at him, his expression as tranquil as ever. He paused, allowing the words to settle, then replied, "I appreciate the apology, but more than that, I hope you learn from this." Victor nodded slowly, sensing the opportunity for change in Keanu's words. Keanu added, "Sometimes, what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Victor fell silent, but the weight of Keanu's words lingered. He knew that moment held the potential to transform him, if he let it. A lesson for us all. After disembarking, Victor stood still in the terminal, watching as Keanu disappeared into the crowd. Fans approached Keanu, hoping for a quick picture or a kind word. To each, Keanu responded with patience and a genuine smile, showing no trace of arrogance. Victor sighed, looking at his own hands. He knew he needed to change. Keanu's parting words stayed with him, a reminder that a person's true worth isn't in their status, but in how they treat others. As Keanu vanished from sight, Victor felt something new stirring within him. Hope. Perhaps that encounter hadn't been a coincidence. Perhaps it was a chance to start over. In the end, the choices we make shape who we are. Are we living to impress others, or are we striving to be better people? Keanu's words leave a timeless lesson. True success isn't about what you achieve or show off, but about the positive impact you leave on the world and the lives you touch. So, the next time you find yourself in a moment of judgment or conflict, remember, respect and humility never go out of style. And perhaps, the change you want to see in the world needs to begin with you.